Joy today, and we're slithering right into the day with our first speaker, Lucie. Lucie is a professional activist and human rights researcher. She has spent the last 5 years working for Access Now and has moved on to Digital Rights Watch, an international digital rights NGO working on sorry, I've messed up that. But anyway, she's campaigned for strong encryption against the proliferation of targeted spyware and strong government policies which empower and support individual rights and liberties in the online world. She has a background of international relations and security studies, and she has never lived in any city longer than 4 years. Can we get Lucie to come in now, potentially? Hello, Lucie.
Hi. I didn't make a fancy nickel hat.
Look, there is the entire day, and if you do, post it for everyone to share and enjoy. Hopefully we can all have a bit of a vote later of who's got the fanciest hat.
Ooh, I like it.
So you've mentioned that you've never lived in any city longer than 4 years. How long have you been in Melbourne now?
1.5, coming on to 2 years in January. So we're still good on Melbourne time.
Oh, exciting. Well, we're running a little early, I believe. But is there anything you would like to say, because I messed up your introduction? I know that you've moved on to Digital Rights Watch, which is an Australian-based organization, not international.
It is, yeah, which is very exciting for me because working in the international space, I think you tend to get really overwhelmed by the news cycle because you're not just following your own, you're following everyone's very actively. So for me, it was just after 5 years, I needed a little bit of a break to work on the national level. So I was really happy to be able to step into Digital Rights Watch. And shameless plug, if you don't follow us on Twitter, please do subscribe to our newsletter.
I'm going to back that. They're a fantastic organization and doing some really, really needed work in the digital rights space in Australia. So I'm going to let Lucie take it away. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Liza. Hi, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining me in whichever of the Australian crazy time zones you're in. And I say that after managing global time zones, I'm constantly baffled by the differences just within Australia of 30 minutes and something. So here today to talk about Technosolutionism and human rights. And we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson, but like a very fun history lesson. Don't worry about it. But one of the reasons we thought of doing this talk, because of what happened with coronavirus and the pandemic, I think we saw really what the kind of chaos that Technosolutionism can bring, that sort of springing to action that happened with technological solutions, to contact tracing and restricting people within their own homes. A lot of things I think were floated, and there was a very lively debate about why some of these solutions would work, why some of them wouldn't. And so we thought that would be really an interesting way to dissect how, Technosolutionism unfolds, what is sort of the perfect storm that it creates, and why there's such a danger for human rights. So in the talk today, like I said, there's a little bit of a backgrounder, if you bear with me, but I think the context really sets up the message, which is what I want you to carry away from this, which is that technology is always political. And so we'll go through a little bit of the background, then we'll go through the Technosolutionism, and then I have some examples, both of how it can look sort of when it's disastrous, and also how it can look if it's done well. And hopefully throughout, we'll be able to hammer down about 4 things that you can consider as you go through your lives, interacting, designing, developing technology, and how you contribute to this space. So that's my entry pitch. Let's see, it's the real test if the PowerPoint will. Hey, yes, it works. Perfect. So this is the message that I just mentioned, and that's that technology in essence may be neutral, and that's often a sort of argument that I've gotten from the tech community. It is neutral. As soon as we touch it, it becomes a part of the infrastructure of our lives and our societal, cultural, everything lives. So it inherently becomes political. The important thing here also in this community particularly is as soon as you're working on something open source, you are making a political choice, perhaps the most political choice in technology, because that's, you're exactly in that space that I think governments are very skeptical about, and corporations are very skeptical about, because why are you doing open source? That's a political choice that you've already made to interact with that sort of framework, and that says something about you and your values and the sort of world that you're co-creating. So bear with that in mind, the burden of being extremely political. And then I guess the big point here is that technosolutionism is inherently political. And I will define what technosolutionism is briefly, and we'll come back to why it is political and how that structure plays out. And so, I think for a lot of people, this is a hard pill to swallow. In my space, I work on digital rights, so I know that every choice that I make is in a bigger context. But last year in January, I attended Q Forum, which is it's a very niche little event that happens in Sydney. It happens in the quarantine facilities of Sydney, and it's this conference sort of about quantum computing. And it was myself and Ron Biebert, who runs Citizen Lab, which is a fantastic initiative, which if you don't know, do familiarize yourself with. And we were there, with all these people working on really exciting, like quantum computing designs, applications. And we, for us in the human rights space and in the digital rights space, quantum is sort of the next frontier, because as soon as quantum computing is practically developed, the sort of cryptographic algorithms that we have and all the security that we rely on falls apart very quickly. So for, people who are like us who work with those sort of users, Ron does a lot of that sort of work too. That's a real concern. And it was interesting because when we brought up, this sort of notion of who's funding your research, how is it going to be applied? And a lot of those funders are really big military names. I won't name and shame, but if you really want me to, I'll be in the Discord all day. Happy to do that. And people get really uncomfortable, I think, spending some time with the idea that every action they take in their lives, every action that they take in this sort of ecosystem of research is political, because for them it's essentially just solving a puzzle, right? Or innovation for the, research for the sake of innovation. So we actually got a lot of really sort of negative pushback, and people were saying, how can you say it will be appropriated like that? What about all the other wonderful things it will achieve? And there were a lot of heated discussions, and I just think the reason I bring it up is I think it's a great example of why we need to have tracks like this. As Liza pointed out, it's really timely, to think about all of these issues as we go through all of our everyday lives. And as I was prepping this talk, there was a fantastic article that came out on Wired about a talk by Sunny Kamara from Brown University about crypto for the people. And in the article and in that talk, he sort of talks about how even though, something like encryption ultimately protects certain communities, even there's one step further that he kind of goes to, and he's like, it still hasn't been designed around the specific needs of those communities. And I think that's interesting because it brings up the question of how we even set up the problems that we're trying to solve. So I guess what I've been saying so far is, are we solving the problem in the right way, and are we looking at all eventualities? But the next thing is, are we asking, are we setting ourselves up to solve the right kind of problems, and are we doing a full audit of what needs to get done, before we delve into that? And it's a great article. I mentioned the interviewer and the outlet here in case you guys want to look it up. And the talk is online. And the article actually mentions a 2015 article, which was a nice flashback for me because I've, in the scheme of debating encryption with people in Brussels and in The Hague with Europol and the like, I've really have a big supply of academic articles on the topic. Anyway, it was a nice flashback, and it's an article by Rogaway called "The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work." I would say that's a really, if you haven't encountered it, it's a fantastic place to start. Bruce Schneier has also written about a lot of cryptography and how it interplays with the sort of sociocultural spaces. I'm going to mention him in a little bit because I will talk about export controls incredibly briefly. But anyway, this is a fantastic article, and I pulled out this quote because I think it speaks to some of the bigger questions that this track is trying to ask. And it says, "We don't work in a vacuum, and we're not pure mathematicians. As much as certain cryptographers would like to see themselves as doing pure mathematics on some kind of quest of discovery, that's not an apt description of where we sit. The field does have these very strong political connections and connections to power. And if we just, oh, that's not my domain, that in itself is really politically situated, a historical view, and ultimately quite elitist." And that's, I guess, why I have baked in like the slight little historical ditty that we're going to go on just now, is because I want to, in order, I think, for us to examine how the technosolutionism and the sort of, digital advancement that we're experiencing now, how that interplays with human rights, we kind of can look historically a little bit about how technology has interacted with power and power structures and sort of that fabric. And I think contextualizing it also will make all of you here today, again, thanks for bearing with me at this morning hour, be able to better bake in your own decision making and your own sort of critical analysis of the tools you work on. And so this, this quote from Rogaway goes exactly back to that point I was making about the people who are working on quantum. No doubt that that's, a wonderful puzzle to solve, and it's a fascinating one. But that's, when you start thinking about how is technology interacting with human rights, the point is seeing beyond the puzzle. If the puzzle is going to open 20 doors, your responsibility can't, you're responsible for understanding what's behind those doors. It can't just be blind curiosity. That's the elitist part, I think, that that Rogaway sort of throws in here. Okay, enough about that. So we'll get, I'm actually a little bit ahead with my slide. Okay, so I didn't want to create too many slides because I hate when there's too much text and too many slides on the background, but I didn't just want you guys to look at my mug these whole 25 minutes. So anyway, here we are. So the historical context, I think, of technology, the important thing is to understand it was developed as a wartime technology, as a military technology. And I think we think of the internet, and a lot of people, when they open their computers and their laptops and their phones and whatever, don't think of it that way anymore. But that's how ARPANET got started. It was a solution to a problem of communications for a very specific, set of military agencies and universities. And what we had then, once this technology started trickling into civilian life and into our societies and communities, is we suddenly had these export control wars. Those are the words. And they, that was sort of the characteristic of the 90s. And Bruce Schneier actually wrote a huge amount of articles on this, if you're interested. But what I think is fascinating there is, that's export controls. And I worked on this in Brussels, which is why I talk about it probably so much. You talk about what you know. But it's, it's something that we're still dealing with today. Cryptography particularly, there's been an argument made by tons of civil society that cryptography shouldn't be on those lists anymore. But the reason it is on those lists is because when we when we, when the West, the white people had the technology, we didn't want the world and our communities to benefit from that. So we wanted to be able to spy at everybody else. And so exporting encryption and secure technology was like counterintuitive to the national interest. The national security interest really gets in the way of, I think, like technology functioning well in many ways. And to an extent, you see that encryption war play out to this day, right? We had TOLA, Assistance and Access Act in Australia. Those discussions are very much alive. Apple versus FBI, another really famous case of, you know, how encryption is still under the fire. And so these technologies, you know, are viewed by the state as an asset, and they're constantly viewed as a push and pull internationally. So even though digital platforms, you know, we're all now on the internet and we're all interacting with these services, it's a really fragile, I think, time. And we often kind of, you know, take that for granted. I don't think the situation is sustainable to the level I think we would like. It kind of exists, you know, due to its capitalist benefit to the state, but ultimately, it's a fragile thing. And that's where, again, you know, being open source becomes incredibly political, because sort of decentralized networks, which are independently run, are a little bit of a chaotic element to the state that they can't control. So that's the political choice you're making. And the current environment carries the characteristics, this burden of technology being stuck in this push and pull, and these sort of export controls, tech wars linger very much till this day. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to have the encryption debate for the rest of my lifetime, which I'm pretty sure by 50 I'm going to be incredibly versed at giving talks like this. So that's something to look forward to. But ultimately, to go back to what Rogaway said, you know, everything we do is political, it is moral, it is ethical. And I think we just have to, we can't be sticking our heads in the sand. We need to acknowledge that that's what's happening and interact with that, you know, in a proactive and positive way. So why did I walk us through this history lesson? Huzzah! We've come to an end of the history. You know, digital innovation right now is a buzzword in many halls of government, and everyone wants to be at the forefront of it because, you know, it will save us money, efficiency, it will be wonderful. But I think the history and the framing is essential in understanding how toxic techno-solutionism really can't be. And we haven't resolved these huge underlying issues. So we're building any sort of techno, and we'll be going through some examples now, but all of these things that we're building in the ecosystem that I've just described. And I think that's a key thing to understand and integrate into our work. And as you know, Rogaway and Kamara that I mentioned point out, I think it's important to think through how to proactively and continuously fight through that and develop better things in this horrible ecosystem we've been given. Anyway, so that's why we're here at this talk. Haha, I'm running behind time as always. So the 3 things that we will go over now. What is Technosolutionism? How does it create this perfect storm for mistakes? And how do we anticipate and improve in this environment? How can we do things better given the environment that we are given? So, my notes are covering the screen. Haha, this is not practical. Okay. So Technosolutionism, as a definition, is the view that technology can unilaterally solve difficult social problems. I think in Australia, this is a specifically unique thing. I think the Australian government, almost more than any government I've interacted with, and as you can, I'm from Eastern Europe, as you can tell by my accent, I've lived in many places. Well, also by the intro that Eliza so kindly did earlier. You know, the Australian government really is the most techno-solutionist prone. So in a way, we're in the best place to have this discussion. I'll go over some of the fantastic examples. I'm sure you can already know which ones I'm thinking about. You know, and COVID-19 is a great example of exactly that too. But the important thing I think about techno-solutionism is often it attempts to solve problems we don't have solutions to in the analog world. And I think that's where it gets really complicated. And we see this in my line of work with things like content moderation. You know, terrorist content or violent and extremist content is a super hot topic. Every time something horrible happens in the world, you know, you get this sort of slew of regulators and people thinking, oh, we need to like be more efficient about stamping out this content online. And you know, there's a lot of people who've done really fantastic research on how ineffective these solutions are, because ultimately you can get a really great system of removing content. It can be done, but what you're not doing is actually addressing the ideology and the sort of things that drive people to that content. So that's where techno-solutionism can be really harmful. You can find a technical solution, but it's not solving the real world problem. It's not solving the broader problems. And again, the context, again, to go back to what I said earlier, have you even asked the right, you know, are you solving the right problems? Have you asked the right questions? Voxpol, who are, you know, publishing on this in the UK, I think led by Ian Brown, or they were led by Professor Ian Brown. They did a great paper on this once, where they actually studied on Twitter how networks of extremists and like ISIS recruiters worked, and how deleting their accounts actually served as something in international relations we call rally around the flag phenomenon. Well, it's a fancy term. Can you tell that international relations people are mostly cis white men? Anyway, so rally around the flag, basically what it means is every time content gets removed, they come back stronger, and it helps them as a tool for recruitment. So it actually not only doesn't solve the issue that it's meant to solve, it actually creates a different issue and a little bit perpetuates the problem. And again, techno-solutionism, therefore, is political, because it's the government now trying to implement solutions to problems. Ultimately, that's going to be political. Okay, so time-wise, oh, I'm okay, perfect. 10 minutes, okay, all right, perfect. So COVID-19, the way, you know, and I think a lot of you we've all been completely under a waterfall of news. So I don't have to spend too much time recapping, which is great, because obviously my time management sucks. So what happened is, you know, we suddenly had this global pandemic, and a lot of thinkers have been saying we are prepared for the next global pandemic. They were right. But what happened there is that, you know, you had all of these solutions pop up. The simplest problem was posed. We have huge quantities of the population. How can we contact trace? How can we monitor who's been in touch with who? That was the initial problem, you know, that was given to technologists everywhere. You're the ones who are consulted on this. And I think you know, it takes some things for granted. It takes for granted, for instance, that we want to, you know, it takes for granted the system we exist in. So it wants capitalism to remain capitalism, and it wants us to remain a thriving, busy economy. So you're solving the problem of, if things stay as normal, people are walking around in cities, how do we track them? How do we do this better? It definitely totally ignored, you know, things like indigenous communities who really just wanted to sort of close their borders. You had those cases in New Zealand, you know, they wanted to protect themselves by isolating themselves. Those sort of cases get completely ignored. And ultimately, we solved COVID-19 with these technological solutions for the mainstream snapshot of people, right? We assumed suddenly some of the solutions that were floated were mobile tracking, like through GPS and other things. China implemented this just flat out. You know, so now if you drive near a hotspot in China, a few days later you might get an email that says, "Hey, you drove past the hotspot. Sure, you didn't even get out of the car, but you were there. So come in for a test." And you know, there was an uproar in Europe, I think here and elsewhere, about doing that. So we sort of got to, okay, well, how can we do this without exposing people's location data? And how can we do this, you know, where just maybe you just need to know if the device has been near another device. So we're solving the problem slightly differently. That's how we got the Bluetooth sort of API changes. And I'm hearing that there's a thrilling talk about that later today. I'm not sure if in this track particularly. Anyway, so the issue here is you're solving the mainstream problem. Even with the Bluetooth activation, you are there's still, proximity is something that's shared. And so for us, the problem became, what about victims of domestic violence? What about political people and dissidents? And Israel, really, I have a snapshot here, became a fantastic example of how, the sort of police state apparatus took charge of that and started tracking its own political dissidents and people they didn't like. So that's the sort of problems that you can create. The problem was simple, right? The problem was, how do we contact trace? How can we do that? And we made a series of flawed assumptions that people have phones, that people have functional phones, that people have, phones whose battery can handle Bluetooth being on constantly, that people don't have a problem with their proximity potentially being exposed to other people. There was just, there's a lot. So I guess, when you're, that's sort of the perfect storm that it creates, is because there's an urgency to solve this technological problem. And that's always the case with Technosolutionism. It's presented as a very current thing that we all need to run and cluster around. It creates this environment where we make solutions that are very rash, that don't think about, it's just solving the puzzle. It's not thinking about the 20 doors that it's going to open. And that's a problem. And I guess the other thing, some of the other examples that we can look at are census data collection. So that's more of an example. COVID-19 is a good example of applications and sort of API tweaks to make something function. In the census, I know you all remember the last one very well, made international headlines. For the census, now they put forward this theory of of using private data sets to fix the census data. So there's a social contract that comes with the census. And, now I think people are sitting at the statistics office thinking, yeah, there's all this data floating around. We don't really need people to fill out the form anyway. But even if they don't, or they fill it out partially, we could probably use data from things like the electricity grid or the internet grid to fill out how many people are probably in that household. And so that's a really, I think it's a really toxic example of Technosolutionism that I think is really indicative of government services. You see that there is a technical solution to a problem, but there's a lot of really horrible things that go with that. You could have people, maybe migrant households, which have more people than they've declared. It exposes people in so many different ways. So anyway, a few of us sat in on that consultation, and now statistics people have come back and said, we will not be using that solution just yet. Another one, I think, here in Australia is the, robo-debt issue. And that was a great example of Technosolutionism too. Technology can solve these problems. And it just, certain things, especially when you're dealing, I think, with vulnerable or socioeconomically vulnerable groups, certain solutions just won't work because you need a human element, an ounce of humanity, and some sort of accountability. And that's something that I've learned actually through my years at Access Now. We had this whole framing about users at risk. And I always, when people ask me about any new technology, my test for that is, how will this impact users at risk? How will this impact political dissident? And I just have a quick think through that. And based on these sort of different models, I can really quickly come up with all the adverse ways that can manifest. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up. So are there, and I mentioned here Yevgeny Morozov, who is somewhat of a controversial figure, but, you can look him up. He writes a lot of, I think you can be controversial and have a contribution to the way we think about things. So Morozov argues that this drive to eradicate imperfection and make everything efficient shuts down other avenues of progress and leads ultimately to an algorithm-driven world where Silicon Valley, rather than elected government, determines the shape of the future. He has an issue with both the government and industry, but I think what this quote gets at, and what his second book gets at, is you shut down sort of other progress and other thinking when you develop a really techno-solutionistic response. So there were probably a million different ways to improve the way that debt was calculated, but they decided to go with robo-debt. So it really squashes and squanders sort of innovation and opportunity. Okay, and I'm going to wrap up. Are there good examples? Absolutely. You can look at something like Signal and the way those apps are designed. Now, you can't take screenshots, things auto-delete. Those are examples of, using technology to solve the issues that people encounter, both in the analog world and the digital world. So it really, there is a saving grace. It's not all technology is bad. We just need to contextualize it better. So how do we fix it? And I'm super duper wrapping up now. Thank you, Chris, for the timekeeping. We create and design for the outlier cases. So when you're doing that puzzle solving, think about the 20 doors and solve the puzzle in mind with those people. Do the test that I do. Think about, is there any way that this is adversely affected? Is there any way that this can be abused and misused? Am I creating a data set that will be appropriated by law enforcement that will be used against marginalized communities? Ask yourself those questions. Anticipate features and safeguards, and go back to some of the things that I mentioned by Rogaway and Kamara. Ask yourself, actually go one further, and go and ask yourself, am I even solving the right problem, and are there other problems I could be solving? And the third is build awareness in your community. And I think this multidisciplinary approach is essential. And we need to be talking to each other. We need to be talking between the policy communities, between the campaigning communities, between the technical communities, between the legal communities. So already, thank you for being here. Just by listening to this track and engaging with these topics, I think you're doing fantastic. And I think that will be me for today. Thanks so much for bearing with me while I read a little bit over time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lucie, for your talk. We don't have enough time for Q&A, so we are going to, take questions in Venulous in the security and privacy hallway track. I just want to say thank you again so much for discussing this topic. I know it's a really hard topic for people to sit down and listen to, so thank you to everyone who's sitting here. We've got a small break, and we'll be back at 9:50 Adelaide time or 10:30 Australian Eastern Time.